Hello everyone. Tonight we explore the story of a person, Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, whose name alone struck terror into the hearts of millions. He was the shadow of death riding across the lands of Persia and the Middle East between 1256 and 1265. Wherever he went, rivers turned red with blood and skies black with burning smoke. Cities that had stood for centuries crumbled in fire within days. The walls of Baghdad, once the jewel of the Islamic world, collapsed under his siege. He ordered mountains of skulls to be built as monuments to fear, so no survivor would ever forget his wrath. Scholars, poets, and innocent families were butchered without mercy. Hulagu was not just a conqueror. He was a storm of annihilation, a force that erased civilizations in his march. Tonight, we descend into his world of cruelty, ambition, and fire, where mercy was nothing more than a forgotten word. In the cold steppes of Mongolia, where endless grasslands stretched beneath a sky painted with storms, a child was born in 1217. His name was Hulagu, grandson of the great Genghis Khan. From the moment of his birth, the whispers of destiny surrounded him. Unlike other children, Hulagu was nurtured in a world where war was the language and conquest the religion. Tales of his grandfather's thunderous victories echoed around the fires of his tribe. In those stories, power was not a dream, but an inheritance, and Hulagu's bloodline ensured that one day he too would carry the sword of empire. But no one could have foreseen the scale of terror that tiny child would one day unleash upon the world. As Hulagu grew, his education was not of books, but of horses, bows, and blades. Mongol boys were taught to ride before they could walk firmly. They were hardened by freezing winters and scorching summers, their games soaked in the violence of survival. Hulagu's mentors trained him to shoot arrows while galloping at full speed, to strike fear into the hearts of men long before he ever commanded armies. Every day of his youth sharpened him into a weapon, polished by tradition, sharpened by blood, and ready to be drawn by fate itself. The empire of Genghis was vast, and Hulagu was born into its heartbeat, destined to carve his own mark. The Mongol court was unlike any other in the medieval world. It was a shifting camp of tents, filled with the smell of meat roasting over open fires, with golden vessels resting beside iron swords. Hulagu's mother, Sorghaghtani Beki, was one of the most powerful and intelligent women of the empire. She was known for her wisdom and ability to navigate the brutal politics of Mongol leadership. From her, Hulagu inherited not just ambition, but a ruthless clarity of purpose. She whispered into his ears the importance of loyalty, strategy, and fear. These lessons would one day guide his conquests, making him not just a warrior, but an architect of terror. Hulagu's childhood was filled with stories of Genghis Khan, tales of cities burned, enemies crushed, and empires bent to their knees. Around the campfires, the elders spoke of how Genghis turned weak tribes into the strongest force on earth. Hulagu listened with wide eyes, not merely in awe but with a burning hunger. He wanted the same. He wanted to be remembered as the storm that no wall could withstand, as the shadow that kings trembled before. By the time he reached his youth, the world was already whispering that another Khan was rising, one whose cruelty might even eclipse that of his legendary grandfather. But destiny does not bloom in silence. Hulagu's early years were marked by constant battles for power within the empire itself. His uncles, brothers, and cousins fought endlessly to seize territories and titles. Hulagu grew up in this blood-soaked chessboard, learning quickly that trust was fragile and betrayal was always near. He survived by cunning, by patience, and by proving his worth in combat. Every scar on his body was a medal, every enemy slain a step toward greatness. And yet, behind the eyes of this young warrior flickered something darker, an unrelenting cruelty that even his family would one day fear. The years of Hulagu's youth unfolded against the backdrop of Mongol expansion. His brothers Kublai and Mongke were also rising in stature, each carrying the legacy of Genghis in different ways. Yet Hulagu's path was darker, less restrained. Where Kublai dreamed of governance and trade, Hulagu dreamed of fire and ruin. He saw conquest not only as power, but as a performance of fear. Every raid he joined, every village he burned, only deepened his thirst. Among his peers he was already gaining a reputation as merciless, a warrior whose smile was colder than steel, and whose silence often meant death. It was during his early campaigns that Hulagu first displayed the cruelty that would define his legend. Captured prisoners were not merely executed. They were arranged in grotesque displays. Some were impaled, others decapitated, their skulls collected in heaps as offerings to the Mongol gods of war. Hulagu learned that terror could travel faster than any horse. News of his brutality spread ahead of his armies, making walls collapse and defenders surrender before the first arrow was loosed. Fear was his truest weapon, and he wielded it with precision. But Hulagu was not without intelligence. He understood that cruelty alone could not bind empires. From his mother, he inherited the gift of strategy. He studied the geography of Persia, the riches of Mesopotamia, and the weakness of rival dynasties. While other young nobles indulged in luxury, Hulagu spent long nights planning campaigns that would one day shake the Islamic world. His eyes glimmered not with gold, but with visions of fire consuming the great cities of Baghdad, Aleppo, and Damascus. He knew his destiny stretched far beyond the steppes. His rise was not sudden, but carefully cultivated. By his 20s, Hulagu had already earned the respect of Mongol generals who had once fought under Genghis himself. They saw in him the same unbreakable will, the same hunger for dominion. Yet they also noticed something even Genghis had not embodied so fully, an almost sadistic pleasure in destruction. Hulagu did not merely conquer, he relished the suffering of his enemies. To him, fear was not only a weapon, but a form of art, sculpted in blood and bone. As Hulagu stepped deeper into adulthood, the empire itself was at a turning point. Mongke Khan, his elder brother, rose to the throne of the great Khan in 1251. From this seat of ultimate power, Mongke summoned Hulagu with a command that would ignite his destiny: to lead a massive western campaign, to subdue Persia, to crush the Islamic dynasties, and to expand Mongol terror into lands that had never before felt the hoofbeats of their horses. Hulagu accepted, his eyes burning with anticipation. He would not just obey, he would surpass even the command, turning conquest into apocalypse. When Mongke Khan summoned Hulagu, the order was not simply a military assignment, it was a coronation of destiny. The great Khan entrusted him with one of the largest armies ever assembled under Mongol banners. Warriors from the farthest reaches of the empire, archers from the steppes, engineers from China, horsemen from Central Asia, were gathered for a single purpose. Hulagu's campaign would not be a raid. It would be a tidal wave meant to engulf the Western world. And for Hulagu, it was the long-awaited chance to carve his name into the flesh of history. The army that Hulagu inherited was vast beyond imagination. Chroniclers wrote of more than 150,000 soldiers, though the exact numbers remain debated. What mattered was their diversity and unity under Mongol command. Siege engineers, masters of catapults and fire, marched alongside mounted archers who could pierce armor at full gallop. Blacksmiths, stonemasons, and even astrologers joined the horde, each contributing to the machinery of war. Behind them trailed endless herds of horses, wagons of supplies, and families who would build the new Mongol frontier. Hulagu's camp was not just an army, it was a moving civilization preparing to devour others. But Mongke's orders came with clarity. Hulagu was to subdue the Nizari Ismailis, known to the world as the assassins, whose mountain fortresses had defied rulers for centuries. After crushing them, he was to confront the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, the spiritual and political heart of the Islamic world. The command was staggering in its scope. Hulagu understood what this meant. He was not simply to conquer cities, he was to extinguish the flame of civilizations. His cruelty, sharpened since youth, would now find its greatest stage. Before he set out, Hulagu surrounded himself with trusted commanders. Among them was Kitbuka, a skilled general of Christian faith whose loyalty I would prove unshakable. Hulagu's genius lay not only in destruction, but also in manipulation. He knew how to unite warriors of different lands and religions under a single cause, fear and glory. To his soldiers, he promised plunder beyond imagination. To his generals, he promised eternal fame. To himself, he promised a world carved by fire, a world where his name would reign above all. The first steps of the campaign thundered across Persia in 1256. Hulagu's banners rippled against the cold winds, and his warriors moved like an endless tide across the land. Villages emptied before him, farmers abandoned their fields, and rumors of his cruelty raced ahead like a curse. Everywhere he went, fear arrived first, opening gates before his armies even appeared. The shadow of Hulagu was larger than the man himself, a darkness spreading westward. His legend was already taking shape, not as a conqueror alone, but as the executioner of civilizations. Hulagu's first true test came with the fabled assassins of Persia. For centuries, this mysterious sect had haunted rulers with sudden daggers and whispered threats. Their fortresses, perched atop jagged mountains, were said to be impregnable. Many kings had tried to crush them. All had failed. But Hulagu approached them not with hesitation, but with cold precision. He gathered his siege engineers, studied the terrain, and prepared to do what no one had done before: erase the assassins from the map. The strongholds of the assassins were not ordinary castles. Alamut, their greatest fortress, sat high upon cliffs so steep they seemed untouchable. Its walls blended with the mountain itself, daring any invader to scale its heights. Yet Hulagu was not daunted. His army swarmed around the base of the mountains, cutting off every path, starving the assassins of food and hope. He brought forth massive siege engines, crafted with the knowledge of Chinese engineers, capable of hurling stones that shattered even the mightiest walls. The assassins watched from above as the Mongols tightened their grip like a noose. What followed was a slow suffocation. Fortress by fortress, the assassins fell. Hulagu's men destroyed their crops, poisoned their water, and cut down anyone who tried to escape. Terror spread within the mountain strongholds, and at last, their leader submitted. The assassins, once the most feared sect in the Islamic world, bowed to Hulagu's might. Some chroniclers say he spared their lives briefly, only to slaughter them later as a warning to others. What is certain is that by the end of 1256, the assassins were no more. Hulagu had accomplished in months what kings had failed to do in centuries. The fall of the assassins sent shockwaves across the Middle East. Hulagu was no longer seen merely as a Mongol prince, but as a force of nature. His cruelty was whispered in market places, his victories retold in trembling voices. Even before reaching Baghdad, Hulagu had branded himself into history. His soldiers grew drunk on triumph, their confidence swelling with each conquest. The world was learning a new truth. Nothing could stand against Hulagu's horde. But Hulagu was only beginning. As winter's chill swept across Persia, his eyes turned toward Baghdad, the city of cities, the heart of the Islamic world, and the jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate. Its libraries overflowed with knowledge, its mosques echoed with prayers, and its caliph claimed to be the leader of all Muslims. To Hulagu, it was not a city, but a prize, and like all prizes, it was destined to burn. The campaign had only just begun, and the greatest storm still lay ahead. The Mongol banners cast long shadows across the Persian plains as Hulagu's army advanced toward its next destiny. With the assassins destroyed, there remained no power strong enough to halt his path. Yet in the distance rose the jewel of the Islamic world, Baghdad, The city was legendary, the beating heart of knowledge, trade and faith. For centuries, it had been a beacon of civilization. Hulagu, however, saw it as a monument waiting to fall, a fire yet to be lit. The command from Mongol was clear: Baghdad must be taken, and the Caliph humbled. To Hulagu, there could be no half measures. Baghdad was not simply to be captured, it was to be obliterated. The Abbasid Caliphate had long since fallen from the glory of its golden age. Where once its influence stretched across continents, now its authority had shrunk to Baghdad and its surrounding lands. The Caliph, al-Mustasim, was more a symbol than a ruler, a man unprepared for the storm that was about to descend upon him. He relied on advisors who fed him lies of Mongol weakness, assuring him that Baghdad's walls and the blessings of God would protect them. But Baghdad's fate was sealed the moment Hulagu turned his gaze toward it. The Mongols had never failed when united, and now they were led by a man who thrived on destruction. As Hulagu advanced, he gathered reinforcements from every conquered land. Engineers skilled in building bridges, smiths forging new weapons, and laborers conscripted into carrying siege equipment all joined the tide. His army grew into a moving machine of death. Chroniclers tell us that the Mongol horde stretched so far across the horizon that the earth itself seemed to groan beneath them. Behind their march, villages lay in ruin, fields were trampled into dust, and survivors fled with stories of horror that spread like wildfire ahead of the invaders. Baghdad, though mighty, was isolated, nay, warring rulers who might have aided the Caliph dared not move against Hulagu. They had seen what happened to the assassins, to Persia's fortresses, to those who resisted. Fear chained their hands. Hulagu's strategy was not only military but psychological. Before his armies even arrived, his enemies were already broken. Baghdad stood alone, wrapped in its pride, unaware that the noose had already been placed around its neck. Yet Hulagu was not reckless. He studied the terrain carefully, knowing the Tigris River could serve both as shield and trap. He positioned his forces with precision, encircling Baghdad from every side. His siege engines were prepared, his bridges ready to cross the waters, his cavalry eager for slaughter. But before the first strike, Hulagu sent an ultimatum to the Caliph: submit and open the gates, or face annihilation. The message carried no ambiguity. It was not a negotiation. It was a death sentence disguised as mercy. The Caliph al-Mustasim, blinded by arrogance and poor counsel, dismissed Hulagu's ultimatum. He believed Baghdad's walls were unbreachable, its people too numerous, and divine favor unshakable. His advisors, some out of pride and others out of ignorance, assured him that the Mongols would falter before the city's defenses. But Baghdad had underestimated the storm. Hulagu was no ordinary invader. He was a man who had already crushed fortresses thought untouchable. His patience was as sharp as his cruelty, and he was prepared to grind Baghdad into dust. The Mongols moved with terrifying efficiency. Siege towers rose like giants around the city. Catapults capable of hurling massive stones and flaming missiles were assembled with the precision of master craftsmen. The Tigris River, once a lifeline to Baghdad, was manipulated by Hulagu's engineers to flood and isolate sections of the city. Step by step, the noose tightened. The defenders, once confident, began to feel the weight of dread pressing against their chests. The walls that had protected them for centuries now felt fragile against the thunder of Hulagu's siege. Inside Baghdad, panic grew. Citizens who once walked proudly through the city's golden streets now whispered of doom. Food supplies dwindled as the Mongols cut off every path of escape. Refugees poured into the city from surrounding towns, bringing tales of massacres and rivers of blood. The Caliph, still clinging to false hope, failed to unite his people. Instead of rallying, Baghdad fractured, its defenders demoralized, its citizens praying for a miracle that would never come. The Mongols thrived on such fear, knowing that despair was the first crack in any fortress. The assault came with relentless fury. Stones crashed into Baghdad's walls, towers shuddered under the impact, and fire lit the skies. Hulagu's army showed no fatigue, rotating their soldiers, in waves, ensuring the siege never lost momentum. When breaches appeared, Mongol cavalry surged forward like unleashed wolves. The defenders fought valiantly, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer tide of the horde. For every defender who fell, 10 Mongols advanced. Baghdad's walls, once a symbol of invincibility, began to crumble into dust. At last, in February of 1258, Baghdad fell. The gates were shattered, the defenders slaughtered, and Hulagu's soldiers poured into the city like a flood of death. What followed was one of the most infamous massacres in human history. For days, the Mongols killed without restraint. Men, women, children, scholars and imams, all were struck down. Libraries that had preserved centuries of human knowledge were set ablaze, their scrolls and books thrown into the Tigris, until the river ran black with ink and red with blood. The jewel of the Islamic world was reduced to ashes, and its people to corpses. Hulagu had turned Baghdad into a monument of terror, and the world would never forget it. The capture of Baghdad was more than a military victory. It was the death of an era. The Abbasid Caliphate, once the spiritual authority for millions of Muslims, lay broken beneath Hulagu's boots. For centuries, the Caliph had been seen as the commander of the faithful, a figure whose words carried divine weight. But in Hulagu's eyes, Al-Mustasim was nothing more than another ruler to be crushed, another symbol to be desecrated. Hulagu's fury had not yet been spent. He would make the fall of the Caliphate a warning carved into history itself. When the Mongols stormed Baghdad, the Caliph was captured alive. This was no accident. Hulagu wanted him humiliated, wanted the world to see the mighty Caliph stripped of power, caged like a helpless animal. Chroniclers describe Al-Mustasim being dragged before Hulagu, trembling, surrounded by the corpses of his people. His pleas fell on deaf ears. Hulagu was not a man to be swayed by prayer or promises. He viewed mercy as weakness, and weakness was something he despised. The Caliph, once a sovereign of millions, now stood powerless before the executioner of his empire. What followed became the stuff of legend. Hulagu, bound by Mongol custom that forbade royal blood from being spilled on the earth, devised a crueler fate. Al-Mustasim was rolled into a carpet, his body wrapped tightly until he could not move, and then trampled beneath the hooves of horses until life left his bones. It was not only a death, but a spectacle, a deliberate act meant to mock the sanctity of his position. In one moment, the spiritual head of Islam was reduced to nothing more than dust beneath Mongol horses. The symbolism was devastating. The Abbasid dynasty had ruled for over 5 centuries, and Baghdad had been its shining jewel. Its fall reverberated far beyond the Middle East, shaking the Islamic world to its core. Cities as far as Cairo and Damascus, the seas trembled, fearing they would be next. Scholars wept at the loss of libraries where entire civilizations of knowledge had been preserved. Philosophers mourned the end of Baghdad's golden age. To them, Hulagu was not simply a conqueror, he was the destroyer of worlds. But to Hulagu, this was only the beginning. He reveled in the destruction, proud that he had achieved what countless others had failed to do. He had annihilated the Caliphate, silenced the heart of Islam, and turned Baghdad into a ruin that would echo through history. Yet, in his triumph, a new horizon appeared. Beyond Baghdad lay Syria, Damascus, and the remnants of other dynasties. His hunger was not satisfied. His army, swollen with confidence and bloodlust, demanded more. And Hulagu, with fire in his veins, was prepared to grant it. As Baghdad burned, Hulagu ensured that no memory of its greatness would remain. His soldiers looted treasures from palaces and mosques, carrying away gold, silver, and jeweled relics. Priceless works of art were smashed, sacred manuscripts hurled into flames, and entire neighborhoods reduced to ash. Survivors who hid in cellars or mosques were dragged into the streets and slaughtered. The Mongols left behind not just a conquered city, but a graveyard where silence was broken only by the crows that feasted on corpses. To the outside world, Baghdad's fall was not a defeat. It was an apocalypse. The scale of the massacre defied imagination. Chroniclers recorded hundreds of thousands killed, though some claimed the dead numbered over 1 million. The Tigris River itself was said to run red with blood and black with ink, as countless manuscripts were thrown into its waters. For generations, Baghdad had been the heart of science, philosophy, and art. Under Hulagu, it became the tomb of knowledge, its brilliance extinguished in days of fire and slaughter. The Mongols had not only crushed a city, they had buried centuries of human achievement beneath rubble and bones. Yet even amid this carnage, Hulagu revealed another side of his nature. He spared Christians within Baghdad, influenced by his close general Kitbuka and his own Christian wife, Dokuz Khatun. Churches were protected, even as mosques and libraries crumbled. To Hulagu, this was not mercy, but politics. By sparing some, he strengthened alliances with Christian rulers in the region, who now looked to him as a potential liberator against Muslim dynasties. Hulagu was not driven by faith, only by strategy, power, and the endless hunger to dominate. The execution of the Caliph and the destruction of Baghdad sent shockwaves through the Islamic world. Many believed it was the end of days, a punishment for sins too great to be forgiven. Pilgrims carried the stories of horror across continents, of streets carpeted with the dead, of the stench of burning flesh, of children impaled before their mothers. Everywhere rulers debated, should they resist Hulagu and risk annihilation, or submit and hope for survival? Fear became the language of diplomacy, and Hulagu spoke it fluently. For Hulagu, however, the victory was not an ending, but a door to greater conquest. With Baghdad destroyed, he looked towards Syria and the Levant, where the Ayyubid rulers and the rising Mamluks of Egypt still held sway. To the west lay the Crusader states, fractured but still breathing. Hulagu believed nothing could stop him now. The world had seen what he was capable of, and in the ruins of Baghdad, his army marched forward, ready to carve deeper into history with fire and blood. With Baghdad reduced to ashes, Hulagu's gaze shifted westward. The once mighty Abbasid Caliphate was gone, and now Syria stood exposed like a lamb before the wolf. To Hulagu, this land was not just another conquest. It was a gateway. Damascus, Aleppo, and beyond them, the shores of the Mediterranean, where crusaders and Muslim rulers alike vied for power. If Baghdad had been a symbol to destroy, Syria was a prize to possess. The Mongol war machine, swollen with confidence and fresh from its triumph, surged forward like a storm cloud rolling over the desert. Aleppo was the first target. The city was famed for its walls and its commerce, a place where merchants from across the world gathered to trade silk, spices, and gems. Its people believed their defenses could withstand even the Mongols, but Hulagu had already crushed fortresses thought untouchable, and Aleppo was no different. His catapults hurled stones that shattered towers. His cavalry swept around the city like vultures circling prey. Within days, Aleppo's defenses cracked. The Mongols poured in, and a massacre followed. Men cut down in the streets, women and children dragged into captivity, mosques set aflame. Aleppo's glory ended in screams and smoke. From Aleppo, Hulagu advanced south, his army now a tidal wave of terror. Panic spread faster than his horsemen. Villages emptied before the Mongols arrived, and entire towns surrendered without a fight, hoping to avoid Aleppo's fate. Yet Hulagu's wrath was not easily appeased. Some who surrendered were spared briefly, only to be slaughtered later as examples. His cruelty was deliberate, a message carved into flesh. Resistance or submission mattered little, for the Mongol tide consumed all. In the Chronicles of Syria, his march was remembered not as a campaign, but as an apocalypse. Then came Damascus, the jewel of Syria, a city celebrated for its gardens, its mosque, US, and its culture. Unlike Aleppo, Damascus saw the Mongol horde approaching and did not deceive itself. Its rulers sent envoys to Hulagu, begging for terms of surrender. Hulagu, satisfied that his reputation alone had broken the will of the city, accepted the surrender. The gates opened, and the Mongols entered not by fire, but by fear. Though spared the total destruction of Baghdad and Aleppo, Damascus was forced into submission, its treasures seized, and its people left trembling under Mongol rule. The city of gardens was reduced to a vassal of Hulagu's empire. But not all of Syria fell so easily. As Hulagu tightened his grip, news spread to Egypt, where the Mamluks, warriors forged from former slaves, watched with rising alarm. They understood what others had failed to grasp. Hulagu would not stop. The Mongols were a flood, and the only question was whether they would drown the Nile as they had the Tigris. The Mamluks began to prepare, sharpening their swords and rallying their armies. A confrontation was coming, one that would decide not just the fate of Syria, but the survival of the Islamic world itself. The Mongols pressed deeper into Syria, and in every city their shadow grew longer. For Hulagu, this campaign was not only about conquest, it was about intimidation. He wanted the entire Muslim world to understand that resistance meant annihilation. Chroniclers tell of severed heads piled into pyramids outside city gates, a grim monument to Mongol dominance. The scent of death followed his army, carried by desert winds, lingering long after the soldiers had passed. To the survivors, the very name Hulagu became a whispered curse. Yet despite the terror, sparks of resistance still flickered. In some towns, clerics rallied the faithful, urging them to defend their homes against the infidels. Warriors strapped on armor with trembling hands, knowing they could not win but unwilling to surrender. These last stands, though doomed, became stories of bravery in the face of hopeless odds. The Mongols crushed them all, but the blood of martyrs soaked the soil, planting seeds of defiance that would later bloom into stronger resistance. Hulagu, however, dismissed such uprisings as meaningless insects beneath his stallion's hooves. In Damascus, life under Mongol control was tense, the city's proud people reduced to silence. Markets still bustled, but only under Mongol watchful eyes. Taxes were demanded in crushing sums, wealth drained to feed Hulagu's empire. Artisans and scholars continued their work, yet always with the knowledge that the conqueror could decide their fate at any moment. The gardens of Damascus bloomed, but their beauty masked a city choking on fear. Hulagu did not need to destroy Damascus as he had Baghdad. The weight of submission was enough to keep it shackled. Meanwhile, Hulagu's ambitions turned toward the greater stage. To the west lay the Crusader states, fractured and weak. The Mongols reached out with offers of alliance, exploiting old rivalries between Caïsirs, Ristians and Muslims. Some Crusaders, blinded by hatred of their Muslim enemies, welcomed Mongol envoys, imagining a partnership. But others, wary of Hulagu's cruelty, hesitated. These political games added layers of tension to the Syrian campaign, as the Mongols became not only conquerors, but also manipulators of alliances. The chessboard of the Middle East was being rearranged piece by piece under Hulagu's hand. By 1260, Hulagu's armies had carved Syria into submission. Aleppo burned, Damascus bowed, and fear spread like wildfire across the region. Yet Hulagu could not savor his triumph for long. News from the east called him back. The great Khan Monka had died, and Hulagu had to secure his position in the empire's succession struggle. As he withdrew a large portion of his army, the balance shifted. The Mamluks of Egypt, watching patiently, now saw their chance. The clash between Hulagu's forces and the Mamluks would ignite at ʿAyn Jālūt, a battle that would determine whether the Mongol tide would continue west or finally be stopped. The death of Hulagu Khan in 1259 sent shockwaves across the Mongol world. Hulagu, though still deep in his Syrian campaigns, understood at once the gravity of this moment. Succession disputes among the Mongols were never peaceful affairs. Every brother, cousin and general became a rival, and the fate of the empire itself often hung on the outcome. Hulagu knew he had to return east to safeguard his influence, but withdrawing meant leaving his hard-won conquests vulnerable. His ambitions for dominance in the Middle East collided with the brutal reality of Mongol politics. As Hulagu prepared to march back, he faced a dilemma. He could not simply abandon the lands he had crushed. Aleppo, Damascus, and countless smaller cities now lay under Mongol banners. But to maintain them, he needed troops. And to secure his own position, he needed those same soldiers by his side. Hulagu chose pragmatism. He would leave a reduced force to hold the Syrian frontier, while he returned east with the bulk of his army. It was a gamble, one that placed immense trust in his generals and the reputation of Mongol terror to keep the conquered territories subdued. This thinning of Mongol strength did not go unnoticed. To the south, in Cairo, the Mamluks had been watching every movement. The Mamluks, slave soldiers turned rulers, were fierce warriors forged from hardship. Their leader, Sultan Qutuz, saw Hulagu's withdrawal not as retreat, but as opportunity. For years, the Muslim world had been crushed beneath Mongol hooves, city after city obliterated. But now, for the first time, a chance emerged to strike back. The Mamluks knew it would be risky, but they also understood that if they failed to act, Hulagu would return with greater strength and crush them once and for all. When Mongol envoys arrived in Cairo, demanding submission on Hulagu's behalf, Qutuz gave his reply with steel. He ordered the envoys executed, their bodies displayed as a declaration of defiance. This act was more than rebellion. It was a direct challenge to the might of the Mongol Empire. Hulagu's reduced forces, commanded by his trusted general Kitbuka, would now face the full fury of the Mamluks. The Middle East, long crushed beneath Mongol terror, trembled as whispers spread. Perhaps the invincible conquerors could be beaten. Kitbuka, though outnumbered, was no coward. He had seen the Mongol tide wash over Persia and Mesopotamia, and he carried himself with the arrogance of a man who believed victory was his birthright. With his smaller force, he advanced to meet the Mamluks in the valley of Jezreel, near a place called ʿAyn Jālūt. The air was thick with tension, for this was no ordinary battle. To the Mongols, it was a test of their unbroken reputation. To the Mamluks, it was survival itself. Across the plains, two worlds collided. Steppe horsemen hardened by conquest against slave soldiers who had risen to claim a throne. At dawn, the two armies faced each other under the scorching Middle Eastern sun. The Mongols rode forward with their thunderous cavalry, arrows whistling through the air. For decades, this had been the same unstoppable tactic that crushed armies from China to Baghdad. Yet the Mamluks, trained in the same arts of mounted warfare, countered with discipline and precision. They feigned retreat, drawing Kitbuka's cavalry into a trap laid carefully among the hills. The battlefield became a chessboard, and for the first time in decades, the Mongols were no longer the only masters of the game. As Kitbuka pressed forward, confident in Mongol superiority, he suddenly found his troops surrounded. Hidden Mamluk regiments emerged from cover, striking the Mongols from the flanks. The desert winds filled with dust, screams, and the clash of steel. Arrows rained down like a storm. Still, Kitbuka fought with fury, rallying his men to stand their ground. His defiance echoed the pride of Hulagu himself, but no pride could change the tide that was turning against him. The Mamluks pressed harder, determined to prove that even Mongols could bleed. The Battle of ʿAyn Jālūt was unlike anything the Mongols had faced before. Their fearsome aura of invincibility began to crack. For the first time, panic spread among the horsemen who had once shattered empires. The Mamluks struck with relentless courage, their war cries piercing the chaos of combat. Kitbuka refused to surrender, cutting down enemies until he was overwhelmed and captured. His death on the battlefield marked not just the fall of a general, but the first true fracture in the myth of Mongol supremacy. When word of ʿAyn Jālūt reached Hulagu, he was consumed by rage. The Mongols had been defeated by a power they had considered beneath them. Hulagu swore vengeance, but the great distances, the politics of succession, and the divvy ideal state of the Mongol world held him back. The Middle East would never again tremble in quite the same way. ʿayn Jālūt was more than a battle. It was a turning point. The Mongols had shown weakness, and in weakness they lost the terror that had been their greatest weapon. Still, Hulagu was not broken. Though his dream of Syria slipped away, he remained master of Persia and Mesopotamia. His Ilkhanate was now firmly entrenched, and from his seat of power he would continue to shape the destiny of the region. But the lesson of Āyn Jālūt haunted him. The Mongol tide could be resisted. The world that had once seemed destined to fall entirely beneath his shadow now held defenders bold enough to stand against it. Hulagu's empire was vast, but no longer invincible. After the shattering news of Āyn Jālūt, Hulagu Khan refocused his energy on consolidating the heart of his empire. The Ilkhanate, as his dominion came to be called, stretched across Persia, Mesopotamia, and parts of Anatolia. It was a land rich in culture, wealth, and ancient cities, but also fractured by centuries of rivalries. Hulagu's rule was brutal, yet calculated. He knew that to maintain his authority, he had to combine the Mongol tradition of fear with a system of governance that could hold diverse peoples together under one banner. His reign became a blend of destruction and construction, chaos and order. In Persia, Hulagu established his capital at Maraga, where he sought not only to rule, but also to leave a mark of permanence. He invited artisans, scholars, and administrators to his court, ensuring that Mongol power was more than just military dominance. Yet beneath this effort at stability lay an iron fist. Rebellions were crushed without mercy. Those who resisted were slaughtered. Entire towns were erased as warnings to others. Hulagu built his authority upon fear, but he also laid foundations for a dynasty that would endure beyond his lifetime. One of Hulagu's most surprising endeavors was his interest in science and knowledge. Despite his reputation as a destroyer, he patronized learning. At Maraga, he established an observatory, commissioning the brilliant Persian scholar Nasir al-Din al-Tusi to lead it. This center became one of the most advanced of its time, housing instruments and texts that guided astronomical study for centuries. The paradox of Hulagu's character emerged here. The same man who reduced Baghdad's libraries to ashes now funded new institutions of knowledge, as though trying to balance destruction with creation. Religion, however, remained a point of tension within Hulagu's domain. He himself leaned toward Buddhism, though many of his Mongol companions remained shamanistic. His wife, Doku's Khatun, was a devout Nestorian Christian, and through her influence, Christians were given favored status. Yet the majority of his subjects were Muslim, still reeling from the devastation of Baghdad. This imbalance sowed deep resentment, as many saw Hulagu not as a ruler, but as a foreign tyrant who trampled upon their faith. The seeds of rebellion and religious strife quietly took root during this period. Hulagu's governance was therefore a delicate act, balancing Mongol traditions, Persian administration, and the simmering discontent of his subjects. He built systems of taxation, reorganized trade routes, and sought to control the lucrative Silk Road passages. Wealth flowed into the Ilkhanate, but so too did resentment. While his military power kept enemies at bay, it could not erase the bitterness of conquered peoples. The Ilkhanate was strong, but its foundations were unstable, resting on fear rather than loyalty. Hulagu, however, seemed blind to the long-term consequences of ruling through terror. As Hulagu strengthened his political power, he also poured resources into his military infrastructure. He maintained one of the most formidable armies in the region, composed not only of Mongol cavalry, but also of Persian engineers, Armenian allies, and contingents from subject peoples. This blended force allowed him to project dominance across his realm and intimidate both rivals and subjects alike. Yet maintaining such an army required immense wealth, and the burden fell heavily upon the taxed populations, further deepening their resentment. The Ilkhanate thrived on conquest, but it also devoured its own people's prosperity. Cultural transformation, however, was unavoidable. Under Mongol rule, Persia became a melting pot of traditions. Mongol aristocracy intermingled with Persian nobility, while foreign artisans brought new influences. The brutality of conquest had given way to a kind of forced coexistence, producing an empire where Mongol horsemen lived alongside Persian poets, and Christian priests shared cities with Muslim scholars. Hulagu, perhaps unconsciously, was weaving together a patchwork society whose contradictions defined the Ilkhanate. Yet the memory of massacres remained too fresh for true harmony. In many ways, Hulagu embodied the duality of empire itself. He was both a patron of science and a butcher of cities, a ruler who fostered culture while silencing dissent with rivers of blood. His empire bore the same contradictions, a land where new knowledge was born amidst ruins, where merchants enriched themselves along secure trade routes while peasants were crushed by taxes, where the remnants of destroyed cities lay beside newly flourishing capitals. The Ilkhanate was powerful, but like its master, it was a beast of two faces. Yet even as Hulagu's power seemed unshakable, shadows loomed over his rule. The humiliation at Jālūt remained an open wound, gnawing at Mongol pride. His subjects whispered of vengeance and justice, while rival Mongol princes plotted their own ambitions. The Ilkhanate was stable enough to function, but beneath its surface, cracks were forming. The ruler who had built towers of skulls to strike fear in the world now faced the reality that fear alone could not secure eternity. Hulagu could command armies, but he could not command the loyalty of hearts. As Hulagu's reign entered its later years, he grew increasingly aware of the fragile balance upon which his empire rested. He had carved out a dominion that stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf, yet he could never truly erase the bloodstains that marked its foundations. Every city he built reminded people of those he had destroyed. Every scholar he patronized recalled the libraries he had burned. The Ilkhanate was a monument to his ambition, but also a reminder of his contradictions. And as Hulagu looked upon his realm, the question remained: would this empire endure, or would it crumble as swiftly as it had risen? By the year 1262, Hulagu Khan stood at a crossroads. His empire had expanded with fire and steel, and his name had become synonymous with terror across Asia and the Middle East. Yet with power came new challenges: diplomacy, loyalty, and survival. No longer could Hulagu rely solely on the raw ferocity of Mongol cavalry. He had to navigate the complexities of ruling over Persians, Arabs, Armenians, Kurds, and Turks, all bound together under his iron fist. The question was whether his brutality could be softened into governance, or whether the very blood that cemented his rule would ultimately corrode it from within. One of Hulagu's greatest concerns was his relationship with his brother, Kublai Khan, who was rising as a powerful contender for supreme authority within the Mongol world. While Hulagu remained loyal to his brother Mongol Khan until the latter's death, the succession crisis fractured the empire. Kublai sought Hulagu's support, and Hulagu, calculating as ever, weighed his options carefully. Aligning with Kublai meant securing influence in the east, but it also meant entangling himself in a new web of Mongol rivalries. His armies were far from the heartland, yet his voice still mattered in the great game of succession. At the same time, Hulagu faced ongoing friction with Berke Khan of the Golden Horde. Berke, a convert to Islam, regarded Hulagu's slaughter of Baghdad as unforgivable. For Berke, it was not just a political rivalry, it was a sacred vendetta. The tension between them escalated into open hostility, marking one of the earliest civil wars within the Mongol world. Two great-grandsons of Genghis Khan now clashed not as brothers in arms, but as bitter enemies divided by faith and ambition. Hulagu's Ilkhanate, still consolidating its rule, found itself under threat from another Mongol power. This fratricidal conflict weakened the myth of Mongol invincibility. For decades, the world had seen them as a united storm, unstoppable in their fury. But now, Hulagu's feud with Berke revealed cracks in that facade. The mighty empire of Genghis was no longer a single beast. It was splintering into rival dynasties, each following its own path. Hulagu's enemies whispered that this was the beginning of the end, the moment when Mongol unity dissolved into Mongol discord. And in many ways, They were right. Hulagu had to fight not just outsiders, but his own kin. Despite these struggles, Hulagu continued to project an image of strength. He fortified cities, rebuilt fortresses, and encouraged loyal nobles to settle in key regions. His capital at Maraga became not only a center of administration, but also a symbol of stability. Hulagu understood that the survival of his empire depended on more than conquest. It required legitimacy. To achieve this, he positioned himself as both a Mongol warlord and a protector of Persian lands, weaving his authority into the ancient traditions of the region. Yet for all his efforts, suspicion lingered. To many Persians, he was still the foreign butcher who had reduced Baghdad to ashes. Hulagu's pursuit of legitimacy also extended to religion, though his relationship with faith remained deeply pragmatic. He personally favored Buddhism and shamanistic traditions, while his wife Dokuz Khatun was a staunch Nestorian Christian. Under their influence, Christians were granted privileges and protection across the Ilkhanate. Churches flourished, and Christian advisors found places of influence in Hulagu's court. Yet this favoritism bred resentment among his Muslim subjects, who still mourned the fall of Baghdad and saw Hulagu as an enemy of Islam. The religious divide within his empire became yet another fault line waiting to fracture. Still, Hulagu proved shrewd in balancing allies. He cultivated ties with European monarchs, who viewed him as a potential partner against their common enemy, the Muslim powers of the Middle East. Letters were exchanged between Hulagu and kings such as Louis IX of France, suggesting possibilities of Grand Crusader Mongol alliances. Though these plans never materialized, the mere prospect reveals how Hulagu stood at the crossroads of civilizations, bridging east and west, even as his sword dripped with the blood of both. Diplomacy, like warfare, was a weapon he wielded with calculation. Yet diplomacy could not erase the truth. Hulagu's empire was forged in terror. In the towns of Mesopotamia and Persia, elders told children of the horsemen who brought fire and ruin, of the sky blackened with smoke as libraries burned, of the rivers clogged with bodies. The psychological scar of Hulagu's campaigns was as real as the physical devastation. Fear lingered in every market, every mosque, every caravan route. Hulagu might rule through treaties and taxes, but in the minds of his subjects, he remained the shadow of death itself. Even within his court, unease was palpable. Hulagu's generals respected him but feared his wrath, for he could be as merciless with his own men as with his enemies. Whispers of betrayal were met with swift and brutal punishment. Some nobles defected, seeking safety under rival Mongol Khans. Others submitted outwardly but plotted in secret. Hulagu's authority was absolute, but it rested on a knife's edge, and everyone around him knew it. His empire appeared mighty, yet it trembled with hidden tensions. In the twilight of his reign, Hulagu began to confront the limits of his power. He could conquer cities and shatter dynasties, but he could not erase the hatred of millions. He could ally with distant kings, but he could not force loyalty upon his own Mongol kin. He could build observatories and sponsor scholars, but he could not silence the voices that branded him the destroyer of Baghdad. Hulagu's legacy was already being written in two conflicting scripts. One that praised him as a patron of science and a ruler of vast dominions, and another that damned him as a butcher whose shadow poisoned generations. The year 1262 marked a turning point in Hulagu's reign, when the fractures within the Mongol world erupted into open war. At the heart of the conflict stood Hulagu Khan, ruler of the Golden Horde and a devout Muslim. Outraged by Hulagu's destruction of Baghdad and the slaughter of the Abbasids, Berk vowed vengeance. Blood ties meant little in the face of faith and principle. For the first time in Mongol history, two branches of Genghis Khan's descendants prepared to shed each other's blood in a war that would shake the empire's foundations. The spark came when Hulagu demanded the Golden Horde recognize his supremacy in Persia and Mesopotamia. Berk refused. Instead, he rallied his forces and declared holy war against his cousin. What had once been an unbreakable Mongol brotherhood, united in conquest, splintered into warring factions. The The vast empire that had terrified the world began to devour itself. Hulagu, accustomed to crushing foreign enemies, now faced a far more dangerous foe. One who knew his strategies, his weaknesses, and the very soul of Mongol warfare. The war that followed was unlike Hulagu's previous campaigns. Against the Abbasids, Armenians, and Syrians, he had wielded overwhelming superiority, relying on siege engines, massed cavalry, and terror. Against Berke, he faced warriors who fought with the same discipline and ferocity as his own. Every tactic he employed was mirrored by his cousin's forces. Raids turned into counter-raids, ambush into counter-ambush. The steppe itself seemed to rebel, as Mongol fought Mongol in battles that left the grasslands soaked with the blood of their kin. Hulagu marched north with his armies, determined to subdue Berke. At first, he gained ground, pushing into territories along the Caucasus and the steppes. Yet the land favored Berke's men. Accustomed to the harsh climate and open plains, they outmaneuvered Hulagu's foes. Berke's with lightning raids. Hulagu's reliance on heavy siege equipment slowed his movements, while Berke's warriors struck fast, burning supply lines and vanishing into the endless horizon. The war turned from conquest into attrition, a test of endurance where Hulagu found himself increasingly on the defensive. The most decisive clash came near the Tigris River in 1262. There, Hulagu's forces and Berke's army met in a brutal confrontation. At first, Hulagu's disciplined formations seemed to hold the field, but Berke, fueled by the conviction of jihad and aided by the harsh winter terrain, turned the tide. Rivers swelled with melted snow, trapping Hulagu's men in treacherous waters. Thousands drowned as they tried to retreat. Hulagu himself barely escaped with his life, retreating south to preserve what remained of his battered army. It was a humiliation unlike any he had ever endured. The defeat at the Tigris River carved deep scars into Hulagu's pride. He, the destroyer of Baghdad, the conqueror of Persia, had been forced to flee by his own kin. The world that once trembled at his name now whispered of his vulnerability. For Hulagu, whose authority rested on fear and dominance, this was more than a military setback. It was a blow to his very identity as a Khan. The unshakable aura of invincibility that had carried him through countless campaigns was broken. But Hulagu was not a man to surrender easily. He returned to Persia and rebuilt his forces, determined to strike again. His wealth and resources allowed him to recruit fresh troops and commission new weapons. Still, he faced an enemy not only across the battlefield, but also within his own empire. Muslim populations under his rule, emboldened by Berke's defiance, grew restless. Rebels began to rise in places once subdued. Hulagu's dream of total control now demanded twice the effort to maintain, for every victory seemed to birth two more challenges. The war with Berke dragged on in fits and starts, neither side able to land a conclusive blow. Hulagu's forces excelled in sieges, but faltered in the steppes. Berke's warriors thrived in the open, but could not crack fortified cities. The conflict became one of attrition, draining the resources of both Khans. Yet Hulagu's empire, reliant on trade through the Silk Road, suffered more. Caravans hesitated to travel across battle-scarred routes, cutting into his revenues and weakening the very economy that fueled his armies. Meanwhile, the greater Mongol world looked on with unease. Kublai Khan, Hulagu's brother, sought to consolidate power in China and establish the Yuan dynasty. The civil war between Berke and Hulagu threatened to tear apart the fragile unity of Genghis Khan's legacy. Once, the Mongols had seemed unstoppable, their thunder rolling across continents. Now, cracks appeared in the empire's foundation. Where once the world feared a united horde, it now saw rival Khans locked in endless strife, weakening the menace that had once seemed eternal. For Hulagu, the conflict was more than a matter of survival. It was a test of his legacy. He had carved his name in history through blood and fire, but Berke had shown the world that Hulagu could bleed. Every campaign from then on was haunted by that truth. His generals, once confident, grew cautious. His enemies, once paralyzed with fear, began to resist with newfound courage. The conqueror of empires now found himself fighting not to expand, but to hold on to what he had built. The later years of Hulagu Khan's life carried a different kind of storm, one not of conquest, but of legacy. His empire stretched across Persia and Mesopotamia, rich in tribute and cities rebuilt under his rule. Yet the shadow of his atrocities never loosened its grip. His court in Maraga glittered with scholars, engineers and advisors, but beneath the surface, whispers of fear and resentment lingered. The same hand that built observatories and mosques was the hand that had reduced Baghdad to ashes. Hulagu's reign was both creation and destruction, locked in a paradox that defined him. Though his campaigns had slowed, Hulagu remained obsessed with maintaining control. He fortified cities, installed loyal governors, and watched over Persia with suspicion. He knew that power in the Mongol world was never secure. A Khan could rise in a season and be undone the next. To ensure stability, he turned increasingly toward administration. Roads were rebuilt to carry troops and goods, markets grew into breeze, and trade with distant lands revived. For a time, prosperity flourished, but the memory of his merciless wars tainted every achievement. Religion also became a battlefield of politics in Hulagu's court. Unlike Berke, he did not embrace Islam. Instead, his Christian wife, Doku's Khatun, influenced him toward tolerance of Nestorian Christianity, while Hulagu himself leaned toward Buddhism and shamanistic traditions of his ancestors. This fractured religious alignment sowed confusion among his subjects, many of whom were Muslim. Though he built mosques for political necessity, his true devotion lay elsewhere, alienating parts of the population and deepening divisions within his realm. Even as Hulagu aged, the rivalry with Berke and his descendants remained an open wound. Skirmishes continued along the northern borders, and his generals often had to defend against raids from the Olden Horde. Though Hulagu secured victories, the cost was heavy, draining men and wealth. He could not shake the truth. His greatest enemy was not some foreign power, but a cousin who shared his blood. In this, Hulagu came to embody the tragic irony of the Mongol Empire's decline. The empire that once crushed the world was now devouring itself. At the same time, Hulagu sought to project his grandeur to allies and enemies alike. Maraga became more than a capital. It was his statement of power. He invited scholars to his observatory, commissioning astronomical charts that would guide sailors and merchants for generations. Yet even as the stars were mapped in precise detail, the fate of his empire seemed increasingly uncertain. Hulagu, the master of skull towers and smoldering cities, now presided over a fragile order that could collapse at any moment. Hulagu's health began to wane by the early 1260s. The once tireless horseman, who had ridden from the steppes to the heart of Mesopotamia, now carried the weight of years and burdens of empire. Accounts describe him as increasingly withdrawn, reflecting more often on omens and dreams. His court physicians struggled to ease his ailments, but the Khan who had seemed unstoppable in youth was now mortal, bound by the same frailty as those he had conquered. Yet even in decline, his presence commanded fear. Few dared look into his eyes without trembling. The shadow of Baghdad's destruction remained his most enduring legacy, and Hulagu seemed to know it. He rarely spoke of that campaign, but when he did, his words carried a mixture of pride and unease. Some chroniclers suggest he feared divine judgment for the massacre, while others claim he boasted of it until his last days. Perhaps both were true. Hulagu embodied contradictions, a man who valued scholars but silenced entire cities, who built observatories but left libraries smouldering in rivers. His life was a balance of brilliance and horror. As death drew closer, Hulagu turned his attention to succession. His eldest son, Abaka, was chosen to inherit the throne, a decision meant to stabilize the empire and ensure continuity. Hulagu spent his final months grooming Abaqa for rule, teaching him the art of both war and diplomacy. Yet he must have known that the empire he carved with blood and fire was fragile. No amount of preparation could shield it from the storms that brewed. Rival Mongol Khans, rebellious cities, and the rising tide of Mamluks to the west. In 1265, Hulagu Khan died, leaving behind an empire that was vast, powerful, but fractured. His body was carried to a secret burial site, as was Mongol custom, guarded by soldiers who swore to protect it. The land he ruled breathed both relief and uncertainty. For some, his death marked the end of terror. For others, it was the fading of a protector who had held chaos at bay. Hulagu was gone, but the memory of his wrath lived on in whispered tales, in broken cities, and in the silent watch of the stars above Maraga. His legacy echoed far beyond his death. Hulagu was remembered as the destroyer of Baghdad, the scourge of the Abbasids, and the architect of the Ilkhanate dynasty. His empire would endure under his descendants, shaping Persia's future for generations. Yet behind every triumph lay the ghost of his cruelty. Hulagu's story ended as it began, in contradiction. A man of vision and brutality, remembered not just for the towers of knowledge he raised, but for the mountains of skulls that bore his name. The death of Hulagu Khan did not bring silence. It brought new struggles that would test the empire he left behind. His chosen heir, Abaqa Khan, inherited both the throne and the burden of Hulagu's legacy. The Ilkhanate stretched across Persia and Mesopotamia, but its foundations were shaky, threatened by external enemies and internal divisions. Abaqa stepped into power with the shadow of his father looming large. Every decision he made was measured against the ruthless standard Hulagu had set. The empire's enemies wasted no time in exploiting Hulagu's death. The Mamluks, emboldened by their victory at ʿAyn Jālūt, pressed westward, striking at cities that once trembled under Mongol power. The Golden Horde, still loyal to Berk's memory, clashed with Ilkhanate forces in the north. Even among Mongol nobles, rivalries flared. The unity Hulagu had enforced through terror began to fray, revealing the fragility of a realm carved by conquest rather than consensus. Abaqa attempted to secure his rule by strengthening ties with Europe. Like his father, he saw potential allies in the Christian kingdoms, sending envoys to the Pope and kings of Europe. His message was clear: join us against the Mamluks, and together we will reclaim Jerusalem. Yet, these appeals often fell on uncertain ears. European monarchs, weary from their own conflicts, hesitated to trust the Mongols fully. The Ilkhanate's dream of a grand alliance with Christendom flickered, but never blazed into reality. Inside the empire, Abaqa's reign carried the imprint of Hulagu's contradictions. He continued to support scholars and rebuild cities, fostering trade routes that reconnected Persia to the wider world. Yet he also waged brutal campaigns to crush rebellions, reminding his subjects that the Ilkhan throne was still a seat of fear. To the merchants of Tigris, he was a patron of prosperity. To the rebels of Syria, he was another Hulagu, carrying the same merciless flame. The memory of Hulagu haunted every corner of the Ilkhanate. His name was spoken in fear, in reverence, and in curses. Abaqa found himself both empowered and shackled by that legacy. To rule as gently as a shepherd risked being seen as weak. To rule as harshly as Hulagu risked rebellion born from resentment. The son of the conqueror stood at a crossroads, torn between the sword and the scroll, between destruction and creation. The choice he made would define the next era of the Ilkhanate. Abaqa's greatest challenge came from the Mamluks. Time and again he prepared armies to march into Syria, determined to reclaim the lands his father had once seized. But each campaign met with fierce resistance, and the memory of ʿAyn Jālūt lingered like a curse. The Mongol horsemen who once seemed unstoppable now faced a disciplined enemy that had learned their ways and turned them against them. The Ilkhanate's ambition to dominate the Levant began to dim under the weight of repeated setbacks. The struggle with the Golden Horde further drained the Ilkhanate's strength. The Mongol world, once united under Genghis Khan's banner, had splintered into rival khanates, each consumed by its own hunger for dominance. Hulagu's brutal clash with Berke had set a precedent of division, and Abaqa inherited this poisoned rivalry. The steppe, which had once been the cradle of Mongol unity, was now the stage for fratricidal wars that bled the empire from within. Yet amidst these struggles, the Ilkhanate retained its place as a bridge between east and west. Tabriz became a hub where merchants, scholars, and diplomats converged. Caravans from China, India, and Byzantium brought silks, spices, and knowledge into the heart of Persia. Though born from Hulagu's sword, the Ilkhanate increasingly leaned on commerce and culture to sustain itself. This paradox defined its identity, forged in violence, but enduring through exchange. In private, Abaqa wrestled with the spectre of his father. Hulagu had left behind tales of terror so vast that they could never be erased. Wherever Abaqa turned, he was reminded of the skull towers, the burning of Baghdad, the screams of cities swallowed by Mongol fire. For some, these acts had secured the empire. For others, they had planted the seeds of endless resistance. Abaqa's reign was less about expanding the empire and more about surviving in its shadow. The 13th century neared its end. The Ilkhanate stood firm but uneasy. Its rulers inherited both the strength and the curses of Hulagu's legacy. Abaqa's successors would grapple with the same dilemmas: alliances that never materialized, wars that drained the land, and the eternal question of whether fear could ever truly hold an empire together. The name of Hulagu remained etched in history, not as a memory that faded, but as a shadow that stretched across generations, shaping the fate of those who dared sit on his throne. The final chapter of Hulagu Khan's story is not only about his conquests, but also about his enduring shadow. Even in death, his legacy shaped the course of history in ways both brutal and transformative. The Ilkhanate he founded became a lasting force in Persia, its rulers drawing legitimacy from his name while struggling to escape the weight of his terror. To speak of Hulagu was to speak of destruction, but also of the empire that rose from its ashes. Hulagu's campaigns had changed the map of the Middle East forever. The fall of Baghdad ended centuries of Abbasid dominance and left a wound that would never truly heal. Great libraries were burned, rivers turned black with ink, and countless lives were extinguished. Yet, the very act of destruction created new realities. The power vacuum allowed new states to emerge, and the Ilkhanate itself became a central player in global trade and diplomacy. In tearing down the old, Hulagu had unwillingly set the stage for something new. The memory of his brutality became a warning passed down through generations. Parents told their children of the Mongols who built towers of skulls, who turned cities into fields of bones. For centuries, his name was invoked as a symbol of fear, a reminder of what unchecked conquest could bring. To his enemies, Hulagu was the horseman of death. To his descendants, he was a figure both to be honored and feared. But Hulagu was not only a destroyer. His patronage of Tabriz helped transform it into one of the most vibrant cities of its age, a meeting point of merchants, scholars, and artisans from across the known world. The paradox of his reign lay in this duality. He was both the fire that consumed and the soil from which new life grew. Historians have long debated whether he should be remembered more for his cruelty or for the empire he built. The truth, perhaps, is that he cannot be separated from either. The Ilkhanate endured for nearly a century after Hulagu's death, guided by rulers who carried his blood but not always his vision. Each Khan faced the challenge of balancing the sword and the scroll, of ruling through strength while fostering stability. In this balance, the mark of Hulagu remained clear. His story was not just the tale of a man, but of an empire carved from fear, ambition, and unrelenting will. The echoes of Hulagu's deeds reached far beyond Persia. In Europe, chronicles spoke of the Mongol terror, often exaggerating it into legend. In the Islamic world, poets and clerics lamented the fall of Baghdad, framing it as a divine punishment and a turning point in history. To this day, his conquest is remembered as one of the darkest episodes in Islamic civilization, a wound etched into collective memory. His descendants, though at times more settled and more tolerant, carried his reputation like a sword drawn from its sheath. The mere mention of Hulagu's name was enough to command loyalty and silence rebellion. Yet, as the Ilkhanate integrated into Persian society, a new culture was born, one that blended Mongol military traditions with Persian art, language, and governance. The brutality of Hulagu had, paradoxically, given way to a flourishing of new forms. Historians still debate the true essence of Hulagu Khan. Was he merely a conqueror, driven by ambition and cruelty? Or was he a ruler who, though drenched in blood, laid the foundation for centuries of cultural and political transformation? His story resists easy judgment. It is the story of a man who was both feared and respected, hated and admired. His contradictions are what make his legacy so enduring. As we close his story, we must return to the image that has haunted this journey from the beginning. The towers of skulls that rose above conquered cities, silent monuments to his will. They stood not only as warnings, but as testaments to the extremes of human ambition. Hulagu's empire was built upon them, and so too was his memory. These towers, though long crumbled, still stand in the imagination of history. Hulagu Khan's reign ended centuries ago, yet his shadow has never lifted. His story is one of destruction and creation, of terror and transformation. To study him is to confront the duality of power, its partistosi, elf, the ability to destroy worlds and to forge them anew. As the final torch burns low, we are left with a chilling truth. Hulagu Khan was not merely a figure of his time, but a force that reshaped the destiny of nations,